Freleng was a master at timing. So in the Pink Panther, one of the things that is unique is that everything is done with timing and action of the panther, subtleties. Other shows, other cartoons, Yogi Bear and all these others, had to depend on dialogue. Now, the animators had a tough hold. They had to tell a story with no dialogue. Once in a while, they'd have voiceover telling the story, but most of the time, the visual gag had to go on its own strength. So over the whole world, the Panther, with no voice, can be understood anywhere in the world, any language. What happened was that Friz Freleng was at Warner Brothers, and then they closed down, but Warner Brothers let them use the facilities with David DePatie and Friz, and they started doing commercials. And then Blake Edwards came to them with a story called The Pink Panther, and he asked them, would they do a title? And they said, oh, fine, that's better than just doing commercials. So Friz and Hawley Pratt sat down, and Friz directed Hawley Pratt into making, Friz made some roughs. Hawley Pratt redefined them, polished them up, and between the two, they came up with many sketches of the Pink Panther. But the thing was that the Pink Panther turned out to be a special thing that clicked with the audience. And on the strength of that, United Artists came and said, will you do a theatrical series of the Pink Panthers? And at that time, I was in New York, and I get a call from David, and he says, get your blank back here. We've got a terrific deal cooking. So I got out of my lease, drove back to California, and I was right with them from the beginning. They wanted to create a series because the title went over so tremendously. In fact, the reviews were saying the title was better than the movie. And with the combination of him giving some rough sketches to Hawley Pratt and giving them some ideas, then Hawley Pratt would polish it up. And Friz said that himself, that Hawley Pratt was his anchor that made everything look good. If you knew Hawley Pratt, he was a tall, slender man, and he was the essence of the Pink Panther. Now, things could have gone a different way. We could have had a short Panther like Friz, but Friz luckily said, no, make him tall like Hawley Pratt, which is good for everybody. When we did the first cells on him, they used a red grease pencil for the outlines, and it gave the Panther a soft look to him, kind of a fuzzy outline. Then for later on, they said, well, let's try Xeroxing it with a black line. I said, no, you're taking the softness away from the Panther. So they tried it, and it just didn't go over well. So they went back to, not the grease pencil this time, they went back to professional girls, they call them inkers, with a brush or a pen. They would just trace the animator's drawings. They put the paper down, then they would take a cell, trace every line in red, then flip it over and put all the colors to it. Like everything else, you trial and error, you try it. During the time we worked together on this, we did come up and try a voice of Rex Harrison one time on a theatrical short.
Why can't man be more like animals?
And we got a lot of bad comments back because many said, oh, that doesn't sound like what I thought the Panther should sound like. So they went back to the pantomime. When we printed up the credits, we would send them out and they would be pressed onto a cell, many letters. Consequently, if there was a mistake in the spelling, we would have to do the whole thing over. So I devised a cut letter system. just cut it out of vinyl sticking paper. So I cut through the paper and transferred the style letters onto the cell. If there was a mistake, all I had to do is take an X-Acto knife, lift the letter off, and replace it with the correct letter. The theatricals that we did, we had the luxury, Frizz had the luxury of taking his time with these. They become what they call, quote unquote, the classics. We didn't have scripts. Nowadays they use scripts. There, each storyboard man was a storyboard artist, and they would write the storyboard and draw it. Frizz would get the writers in his room with the storyboard up on the wall, and then he would act it out and go through it. And then everybody would participate, and someone would say, gee, if this gag here was a little different or twist there, the writer would take notes on that and maybe add it or not add it. And so we had these, they call them snowball sessions, where everybody would participate. So it was kind of a knit group. We'd all get together and have fun with it. What happens is you take a storyboard, and they call it slugging. You take a stopwatch and you kind of act it out, so you can tell just about how much footage you need to tell this storyboard. If you turn out and rough-timed it and said, wow, this is 8 minutes long, it's too long, then the director would say, take out scene 1 and scene 7. Let's crop it up to get down to the 5 or 6 minutes we need. And then it would go transferred to an exposure sheet. Paulie Pratt liked to use a bar sheet so that Henry Mancini could start his music way in advance of the finished animation. He would write out all his actions, expressions, attitudes. Then that bar sheet would be taken to Johnny Burton, who was our top cameraman, and he would transfer it to an exposure sheet, which then would be given to the animator to animate the levels on the exposure sheet. After the exposure sheets, the director gets the animator in the room. He has already planned it, like Paulie Pratt and some of the directors. They would put a folder of extreme poses to direct the animator. Each animator had his assistant, and then the scene would then go to an in-between room where they would put every other drawing in that was needed. Then the cameraman and actually put the pencil test on 35 millimeter film. Then we'd all go into the projection room and we'd run it. As Frizz would sit in there and he'd say, back it up, move it forward. All right, now change the Panther, don't have them do this, have them do that. And then when the lights went up, they would take their scenes back, fix them, and proceed to go into production, ink and paint, and follow through. The layout people would draw the layout. The ink lines would be transferred to a cell, clear cell. We would take those lines on the cells and then turn it over and put loose colors around a window on a cell. And then we'd put some sponge technique on the wall and a little pattern for the floor, just a little bit with a few lines, and then a flat color on a piece of paper, and then drop the cell over it. And that's the style of the technique they used. Paulie Pratt, I consider him my mentor. So one time he gave me a scene to animate, and it was the Pink Panther shadowboxing. So he said to me, here's the sheets, just take 30, 40 feet and just ad-lib it. So I did it and I worked on it. And it came out good and he liked it. So he made me feel good. He rushed into Frizz and he says, come here, take a look at what Art did. So I was writing, designing, wearing many hats. So we had the Pink Panther going, and then when we did series, I had to be there to prepare the presentations, make them unique enough that the networks would pay attention to them. So I got into doing three-dimensional pop-ups. So instead of just handing them a script, we'd hand them this folder and they open it up and something would pop up. And they'd say, wow, this is unique, this is something different. So I was fortunate to have that situation for me. because I'd work on specials, I'd do titles, wash his car, and I never got paid. No, but I would do all that kind of stuff. I had a great opportunity because they would depend on me to prepare the next presentation to the network. So I would be, as I'm finishing up my work, titles, doing all that other work, I would start doing the presentation. So I was never let off. I would be on constantly. My vacations were like one day at a time because they say, we need to get this to the network. And then I was rushed to get that approved so I can get all the people back to work. The pink plasma was a fun one. It was all about a vampire, a little short vampire, and it was the character, again, the little white guy dressed as a vampire. And to this day, I don't know of anyone coming up with a name for him. He was just the little white guy, which happens to be Frizz. You know, all the little characters that he created, Yosemite Sam and the little white guy, that was Frizz. I had a hate-love relationship with Frizz, and everyone else did too. You know, he could be real gruff, and then when somebody said, "Oh, you're too mean on that guy," and then he'd come over and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was so mean." But at the moment, he'd be rah, 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 you know, like that. And toward the end of the movie, Pink Panther's looking out the castle window, and all of a sudden the shoes come up behind him and kick him in the butt. Will you play with me? And that's my voice on there. And I also did a laughing skull in the show at the beginning. So it was fun. You get to wear different hats. Paulie Pratt gave him that loose, tall, wonky look and personality. Frizz added all the timing and subtleties to it. Jerry Shinneke was Frizz Freeling's favorite for any walk cycles that are unique. So he's the one that came up with the Panther's unique little skip and shuffle that he has in his walk. Then John Dunn made the character really come alive with all his funny gags that he came up with. Well, that session went pretty good. Now to hit the road. Well, I've drawn the Panther so many years, I feel like he's a part of me.
father not only was greatly talented and witty and funny, but he was actually the pioneer of animation. And when you think about it, there were 11 people who actually started with Walt Disney and Hugh Harman and my dad, who actually started this very wonderful art form that's so popular today.
My dad was a 17-year-old kid who loved to draw. He lived in Kansas City, Missouri, and his parents wanted him to be a violinist. He was a very good musician. He became a violinist, and I think that was one of his secrets of being a great cartoonist, is his timing. There was an ad in the newspaper in Kansas City, Missouri, and it said, "Delivery boy artist." And he got to the door, and he didn't have the nerve to go in. So he went back and he told his mom that somebody else got the job. Then 2 weeks later, the ad appeared again, and his mother said, "You go back and you get that job." And he went in and he got the job. And that was the beginning. It was called Film Ad. And that was the beginning of his career in animation.
And Walt Disney was working with him, and he said to my dad, "You know, I think I'm going to go out to Hollywood." Walt Disney said that. "And try this new form of art called animation." And so he came out to Hollywood, and the story goes that he said, "You know, that Freeling guy is a pretty good artist. Maybe we can talk him into coming out here and working in this field." So he called my dad, and my dad said, "Well, you know, I'll try it." So my father was a very poor boy. He didn't have really means to get out here. He didn't have a car. So he took a train, and Walt Disney met him at Union Station here in Los Angeles, picked him up and took him to an apartment house, and he went to work for Walt for about 5 years. My dad went by Isidore Freeling for many years. The name was Jewish. And then when World War II broke out, and during the McCarthy era, and quite frankly in Warner Brothers and maybe other studios, they asked him to take the name Isidore off because they couldn't sell it in the South and overseas. So they gave him the name. They gave him the initial I Freeling. They dropped the Isidore. So he walked around for years and he says, "What kind of name is I? You know, who?" In fact, Walt Disney used to call him I.P. Freeling. But so finally, they all said, "You know what? Why don't we try Frisbee?" Well, there was already an artist called Frisbee, so they dropped the B and they call him Frizz. And that name just was very typical of him.
He also felt that whenever he put two letters together, it always became successful. He had Bugs Bunny, Pink Panther, Daffy Duck, and so he felt the two F's together was going to really help his career to be noticed, and Frizz Freeling he thought was a really good name.
My dad was always the same. You know, he was always surprised by his success. I don't think he really realized until later in his life, when he started to be honored in other countries and the Museum of Modern Art honored him, that he really was as great a talent as he was. And I just think he loved his work and really didn't think of himself as a famous man.
I didn't realize that my father was doing something famous, and neither did he. He was such a simple, down-to-earth person. We had a duplex in Los Angeles. We lived upstairs, and Saturdays and Sundays were fixing things around the house. To me, I said to him, "Dad, why aren't you an accountant or a doctor like my other friends? How come you just do drawing of cartoons? That's such a baby job." But he was just the most sincere, down-to-earth person. He loved his wife, Lily, our mother, and he was devoted to his family, the stepping stone in everybody's life.
I believe he had 3 families. I think his first family, and the most important, was us. Lily, his wife, Hope, myself, and then later on his grandchildren. And his second family was the people he worked at Warner Brothers, his colleagues. And I think the third was his characters, his cartoon characters.
We felt like they were brothers and sisters to us. We really did. We felt like we knew every one of his characters, and they were part of the family because they were all him. I used to say to my dad, "How do you direct a cartoon?" He said, "Well, I just put myself into what they would do." And he did have all those personalities.
To me, the Pink Panther was very much somewhat like Bugs Bunny. you know, obviously in a more quiet way, but he was mischievous, you know, so I think there was some of Bugs in the Pink Panther.
He was Bugs, Tweety. Pink Panther was his favorite cartoon character, of course. That was the one that was his baby.
They also, among many of his colleagues, said that he created Yosemite Sam after himself.
But some people think he was the little white guy in the Pink Panther. The little fellow with the mustache and no hair, and he was short. And I think you kind of draw yourself and you don't realize it. So the little white guy in the Pink Panther was very similar to my father.
Because my dad was short, he had red hair when he had hair, and he had a little temper. But he never really admitted to that. I don't think, I think he felt like he was more like the Pink Panther, a little more mischievous and sophisticated.
My mother had a lot of input in a lot of my father's work. She loved high-top hats and tails and canes, that Fred Astaire sophistication, and my dad put that into his characters. We have pictures of Pink Panther with the high-top tails and cane, and I think that was a lot of my mother in him. If you look at the cartoons, they're people, they're humans. They have the feelings and the senses that we have. They have the sensitivity, they have the humor, the cleverness of real human beings. And he just exaggerates what they did. And I think that's what made him a genius. He could tell a story in one frame, just by the expressions. And I think he loved the Pink Panther because he was a mime. And a mime, everybody in the world could understand him. He didn't have to speak any language to be loved. So when he went to Europe, the crowds would just scream and yell because they would love the Pink Panther. It was their favorite character. And it was my dad's favorite. And he won his Oscar with the Pink Panther.
My father won 5 Oscars over his lifetime and 3 Emmys, and I'd say that he was as proud as all of them, you know, and really he was very self-effacing because he never thought he was that good, and it always surprised him when he did win an award. It stunned him, so he was thrilled when he won the Pink Panther, as all of them.
He said that the Pink Panther was the one character that didn't have to have a language. Everybody loved him all over the world. His 40 years, I think my dad expected it to go on for at least another 100 years more. So his love of the Pink Panther, I think he very well expected it to continue.